Hello and welcome to your first video with Broadsword Academy Sacramento Introductory Course. We are going to cover very much the basics of the Scottish broadsword tradition today. We're not going to cover everything. We're not going to go into the complexities of every part. We're just going to get you kind of the basics so that way when you show up to your first class in person, we can get started really easily and not be like a deer in the headlights. So before we get too far ahead, what I want to do is kind of show the scope that can be covered in this tradition. It ranges from as early as, you could argue, 1570s Meyer with the dussack. This was used very differently than how we use the swords later in the tradition, but we wanted to start here. These swords were training swords for various other items, but you could call these hangers, these short, relatively curved. It could be simple hand protection to a little bit more hand protection. These hangers were used for a large portion of history. They go under different names, but these are pretty common, and Meyer's tradition kind of shows how these were used. Then when you get to 1599, we get to George Silver. George Silver's time, we had the broadsword. These were a little bit beefier, bigger. They were 1.3 plus, sometimes 1.5, sometimes even more. Big hand protection, bigger swords. These were used a little bit different than some of the later traditions, but we do cover a little bit of George Silver. Now, when we start getting into more where we're talking about is the late 1600s to all the way through the 1700s for the true, let's call it Scottish broadsword. Some of the weapons taught there are the small sword. This is a very light, elegant, nimble, thrust predominantly weapon that was used by the gentlemen or people just walking around town. We'll talk about the use of this through the system. And then in 1796, this sword existed earlier, but in 1796 the pattern developed called of a spadroon. This is a kind of a beefier version of the small sword, if you will. It can thrust very well, but it can also have some cutting capability. So this is coming in between a small sword and then that heavier broadsword. Also in 1796, we have the 1796 light cavalry-ish. This is a shorter version, a little bit lighter than the cavalry version, but this is used by Black Fencer. These curved, more broad blades were also used under our system. There's a lot of history here, but later on when the Highlanders kind of joined the primary British Army, the heavy broadswords that were used in the past were replaced with the regimental broadswords, which are more in line with the weight of the actual sabers used by the military at the time. We're talking significantly less than a kilo, sometimes as low as like 800 grams. These are a lot lighter. They're sometimes a little shorter, 32 to 36 inches generally. But this is our predominant trainer. It's very useful. It's affordable. But this is kind of when you're getting into the regimental system. And then in the middle of the 1800s, we start getting less curved, a little bit straighter swords for the basic British military that would be okay at cutting, but were a little bit better set off for thrusting than that earlier 1796 heavily curved saber. So we use this sword as well in this tradition. And there's a lot of things within that that's all broken up as well. But those are just some of the tools that you'll get to use that all kind of use a very similar system to what we've been working on. But in this system as well are some bigger swords. This is not actually a claymore, or a so-called claymore, the two-handed sword of the Scots. This is a basic trainer, but we will learn how to use these much larger swords in a different way. And then also, there's pole arms in the system. I just have a quarterstaff here, but we have quarterstaff, different kinds of axes, and bigger weapons that were also used by the Scots during this time frame. So when all said and done, the goal of this is to teach you very much the basics of what we're talking about today, and then we'll dive into more details with all these different weapon types and the nuances within in future videos. But let's just get your feet under you, and I do mean that literally because we're going to start with footwork.